Okay.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody, and we're very sorry for this inconvenience and that we are running late. I'm very grateful to Andrew who made it to, be present, although it's so far away and with a very different jet lag. He's in New Zealand right now. I don't know what time is it, but it's gonna probably very late or an evening or something like that. So thank you for being here. So we start our seminar today, which will be focused on the notion of authenticity in musical performance. And we have three of the most renowned philosophers of music here who have contributed to this topic. And we are very happy to have this chance to give them, right to speak and, to discuss together this issue. And we also know that their work is very, that they have kind of a dialogue going on. So we thought that it could be a nice idea to have them all together discussing these things and, sharing views and so on. So we start, because of time reason, with Andrew Kania. I'm sure everybody knows Andrew. We invited him in our seminar last year. Andrew is one of, again, the most renowned analytic philosophers of music right now. And he will talk about music authenticity. Let me find the title of Andrew's talk, because sorry, I have it on my email, or maybe Andrew will tell. And without further ado, I think I can give the floor to Andrew. So Andrew, go on.
Thanks. Yes, no, it's great to be here. It's, yes, it's late, but not too late on a Friday night here. So hopefully I've been reasonable enough with my cocktail intake at this point to be able to deliver the talk.
We cannot hear.
You can't hear me? Can anyone hear me?
Ok, no, accendi... Però accendere tu, scusa.
Ma fa casino.
Allora, io spengo l'audio.
Ok.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? You can? Okay, great. Thanks. Okay. Yes, well, thanks so much, Lisa, and of course also to Mario and Chiara for putting this workshop together. It's the evening, Friday evening in New Zealand, but I'm very pleased to be able to be with you virtually. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. I should also note that to go along with your technical difficulties, the internet connection here is not totally stable, so it's possible that I will disappear once or twice in the hour, but I'll just rejoin the meeting, so just bear with me. I think it should be relatively quick to rejoin. Apart from the organizers of the workshop, I'd like to thank Julian and Nemesio because, as Lisa mentioned, we've been in dialogue about authenticity in print and in conferences for a little while now, and I would not have thought as carefully about authentic performance as I've been forced to do in response to Julian and Nemesio's work. As you'll soon realize, as Lisa already said, this paper tries to continue that dialogue we've been having. Unfortunately, despite my initial intentions, just because of time constraints, I won't be able to address Nemesio's work explicitly in this talk. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about it in the Q&A. I do think many of the things I'm going to say are related to Nemesio's work, but it turned out that doing the mutatis mutandis was more involved than I thought it would be. And so I thought that the only way to keep myself to anything close to the time limit was to focus on Julian's work, and then hopefully at a later date, or maybe even in the Q&A, talk about Nemesio's. So I do have a PowerPoint, so let me try and put that up. Hopefully that won't cause too many problems. Oh, but I need to be allowed to screen share. Can someone who's a host do that for me? Make me a co-host or something?
Sure. Try again.
Okay, can you see that? Great. Okay, so, well, there's my title. not too informative. The music philosophical debate over the so-called authentic performance of works of Western classical music began in the middle of the 20th century, following the increasing popularity of musicians' attempts to perform works of the Baroque period and earlier on the kinds of instruments that were available to performers when those works were composed, and in the styles which such performers would have considered appropriate. The extant literature on the topic is a labyrinth of twists and turns, but if anything like a consensus view emerged, at least in the world of analytic philosophy of music, its locus classicus is, I think, Stephen Davies' book, Musical Works and Performances. According to Davies, authentic simply means something like genuine, so that an authentic performance is a genuine instance of the work. A theory of authentic performance thus requires an account both of what a work is and the relationship between a work and its instances. According to Davies, a musical work is a contextual, abstract artifact, typically created in the process of producing an authorized score. The score records, implicitly as well as explicitly, both essential individuating properties of the work and optional recommendations. But the score can only be understood according to the conventions of the time and place of its production. As for the relationship between a musical work and its instances, Davies argues that three necessary conditions must be met by any instance of a scored classical work. Now, I put a handout in the chat earlier. That's basically just a bunch of quotations beginning with this one in case people want to refer back to them. So according to Davies, for a performance to be an instance of work, there must be a suitable degree of matching between the performance and the work. The performers must intend to follow most of the instructions specifying the work in question, and there must be a robust causal chain from the performance to the work's creation so that the matching achieved is systematically responsive to the composer's work determinative decisions. Combining these theories of musical works and their performance, we arrive at the view that an authentic performance of a musical work is one that, for the most part, intentionally, causally, and successfully matches the work determinative instructions contextually specified by the composer in the score. The view says nothing normative about the range of performative interpretations a work enables. That's not because Davies doesn't have anything to say about that. It's just that he doesn't think they need to be addressed in articulating an account of authentic performance. With the publication in 2020 of his book, Being True to Works of Music, Julian Dodd shook what consensus there was about authentic performance, much as he'd shaken the consensus about ontological contextualism 13 years earlier with his book, Works of Music. According to Dodd, addressing at least some of the issues raised by the notion of authentic performance requires attention not only to the ontology of musical works and performances in the Western classical tradition, but also to the values implicit in that tradition, what he calls its normative profile. He argues that this profile is three-tiered. On the surface, that is the first tier, are the garden variety performance values, things like interestingness, liveliness, originality, and the rest. Performers freely trade these off against each other for the sake of improving their performance overall. More fundamental, on the second tier, is score compliance, which can't be traded off against first tier performance values. Compliance with the score is a more fundamental value, according to Dodd, and thus non-negotiable for first tier values because it's a final value. It is, we value score compliance for its own sake. However, score compliance is not the ultimate value of the practice, according to Dodd, since though we value it for its own sake, we do so, as he says, only under the condition of its instrumentality. He appeals here to Christine Korsgaard's distinction between something's being valued for its own sake, a matter of how it's valued, and something's being intrinsically valuable, a matter of whether it's valuable independent of anything else. According to Dodd, complying with a work's score has become valued for its own sake within the practice only because it tends to secure another thing we value for its own sake in the practice, namely understanding musical works. This further value a performance as being such that it helps us to understand the work being performed, Dodd calls interpretive authenticity. And it constitutes the third and final tier of value in the practice. Interpretive authenticity occupies its own more fundamentals here because unlike score compliance, its value is independent of any further end within the practice. Interpretive authenticity, or being true to a work by performing it in a way that evinces a subtle or profound understanding of it, is, Dodd says, constitutive of the practice and hence its most fundamental norm, since musical works are composed to be understood. Now, because score compliance and interpretive authenticity are ultimately aimed at evincing the understanding of works and listeners, we should not be surprised that they often go hand in hand. But Dodd marshals several examples supposed to show that these values occasionally conflict. And he argues that because interpretive authenticity is a more fundamental value than score compliance, when the two come into conflict, interpretive authenticity should triumph. To choose to comply with the score at the expense of evincing understanding the work makes no sense, since score compliance is valued even for its own sake, only on condition that it contributes to our understanding of the work. Dodd's examples are fascinating, and it's difficult to resist the temptation to consider them all in all their detail. But for my purposes here, I'm going to focus on two examples, and I'll briefly mention a third later on. First example, in the recapitulation of the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the fanfare introducing the second theme group that was given to the horns in the exposition is this time around given to the bassoons. So, you know, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony probably, ba-ba-ba-bam, ba-ba-ba-bam. And then before the second theme group, we get this horn call, bum 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 bum. The second theme group is that kind of languid string melody, but the fanfare is bum 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 bum. The horns play that the first time, but the second time it's played by the bassoons, with the result that it sounds a little bit weird, right? It's sort of. I don't know how well my imitations come across on Zoom, but hopefully you know the piece. Now, according to Dodd, who's following other people, right? He didn't come up with this example, but it's an example he gives. This instrumentation of the second occurrence of the fanfare given to the bassoons instead of the horns fails to do full justice to the purpose of the fanfare-like motif and the piece's internal logic. Those are two little quotes that'll come up again. But Dodd claims that this is because Beethoven's hand was forced. Horns were practically out of the question, since the valveless horns available to Beethoven could not have played the second fanfare, given the key that the piece is modulated to, which is connected to conventions of sonata form. With modern horns available, however, to people such as Herbert von Karajan, orchestras can now do full justice to the purpose of the fanfare-like motif and the piece's internal logic by having the horns play the fanfare both times. Interpretive authenticity thus trumps score compliance. Second example, Andreas Steyer gives a highly non-score compliant performance of Mozart's Rondo alla Turca, which is the third movement of a Mozart piano sonata, ornamenting and revoicing Mozart's score in a way that's arguably outside the bounds of the performance practice of Mozart's time, yet short of constituting a new work, such as a fantasia based on Mozart's score. But far from flouting the work, according to Dodd, quote, Steyer is trying to produce precisely the kind of interpretation that best evinces the rondo's point, or in Steyer's own words, the integrity of Mozart's conception. So again, interpretive authenticity trumps score compliance. I should note that Dodd doesn't think these choices are the only defensible ones for people performing these works. Different musicians may reasonably decide that these works are best served in terms of interpretive authenticity by complying fully with the score and doing other things, of course. Complying with the score in a way that shows you something about the work. Dodd's point is just that non-score compliant decisions grounded in serious and plausible interpretations of works, understandings of their meanings, don't necessarily result in performances that are any less true to the work, that is, any less authentic than score compliant performances. In an attempt to get into the spirit, I have a little espresso here with some Fernet Branca in it, so forgive the break. The notion of a musical work's meaning, understood as at least including its overall point or significance, to use one phrase that recurs in Dodd's work, plays a crucial role in at least some of Dodd's justifications of controversial work performances as authentic. In what follows, I'll argue first that a work's musical meaning must be understood as more closely connected to its details as represented in the score than Dodd implies, and relatedly, second, that a work's overall point or significance as understood by Dodd can't justify intentional departures from the score as contributing to, rather than detracting from, an authentic performance of a work. Now, happily, much of what Dodd says about musical meaning seems right on the mark to me. First, a musical work's meaning is simply its content, right? So, as he puts it, what there is to be understood in it. So we shouldn't, there aren't great words for this, right? But when we talk about a work's musical meaning, we're not meaning something like the moral of the story or something. It's just like what content there is to be understood in the work. In introducing the notion of interpretively authentic performance, Dodd claims that it, quote, presents the work in a way that makes sense of it, bringing to the surface a deeper kind of musical meaning, a sort of insight into the work that's not specified by the notation. He acknowledges that, quote, there are different ways of delving beneath a work's scored sounds to figure out why it unfolds as it does. Some require us to focus on the purely musical motivations and problems that are solved or not. Others require us to think a little about the mode of composition employed by their composers. Others would have us be guided by the music towards thinking about matters of significance in the extra-musical world. End of quote. Dodd plausibly argues further that musical meaning is an objective, if response-dependent feature of musical works that arises from the composer's manipulation of a culturally contextualized medium. It's not propositional, and it's resistant to paraphrase. Perhaps most crucially for Dodd, there's always in principle the possibility that a new performative interpretation, even one that differs only subtly from extant interpretations, will reveal some part or aspect of the work's meaning that has lain undiscovered until now. What I have difficulty in seeing is how this account of musical meaning leads to the view that an authentic performance of a work may intentionally depart from the score in order to reveal some part or aspect of that meaning. Consider first the example of the Rondo alla Turca. Andreas Steyer knows the work is scored by Mozart very well, and he understands, in virtue of this knowledge, that the point or overall significance of the work, the reason why Mozart manipulated the medium of music in the way that he did, is to produce what he calls a little ethnic showpiece. Given the range of possibilities for performative interpretation allowed by the score, why does Steyer feel compelled to depart so radically from it to communicate the work's point? I presume the answer is that he fears that many contemporary listeners are no longer capable of hearing the humor, exoticism, and showiness of the piece, given the historical distance between its style, or perhaps Dodd would say the style of its score, and what such a style would mean were someone to use it today. This reason for departing from Mozart's score and attempting to communicate the work's point raises a host of related issues. The first issue I'll discuss is how the different cultural contexts occupied by a composer such as Mozart and performers and listeners such as Steyer and ourselves might affect our access to the work's musical meaning. One way of getting started is through the following question. If Steyer can tell from the score, understood as representing Mozart's manipulation of his culturally contextualized musical medium, that the rondo is a little ethnic showpiece, why shouldn't we be able to tell the very same thing from a performance of the score? One answer would be that no contemporary listener can be competent in the sense of being able to hear the ethnic showpiece-ness of the rondo. Sorry, ethnic showpiece-ness, that's just a shorthand label for that aspect of the meaning. So one answer would be, why is he doing this? Because no contemporary listener can hear that in a score-compliant performance of the rondo. Perhaps Steyer thinks that we, including himself, can see or understand this feature by studying the score, say, but we can't actually hear it in score-compliant performances. I think this is implausible, but I won't go into the details here. I feel like I've covered that in print elsewhere. I'm drawing largely on Stephen Davies and others. Another answer would be that although it's not impossible for a contemporary listener to hear the ethnic showpiece of the rondo in a score-compliant performance, the particular audience Steyer is performing for does not in fact understand the musical medium that Mozart was manipulating, or doesn't entirely understand it, perhaps because of their cultural distance from it. But this suggests that this audience does not comprise what we might call well-placed, competent listeners. That is, listeners who can hear a musical work's meaning according to Dodd's response-dependent theory of such meaning. But this in turn, I think, suggests that Steyer's performance is non-standard in the sense in which Dodd uses the term, a sense, crucially, that rules it out as an authentic performance. The example Dodd gives of a non-standard performance is someone who, quote, hacks through a work for fun or to amuse her friends, end of quote. The hacker's performance is non-standard because although she attempts to comply with the score, she doesn't aim at enriching her audience's understanding of the work performed, right? So she's not following that fundamental norm. Steyer does, of course, aim to enrich his audience's understanding of the rondo, according to Dodd. But because his audience is poorly placed to understand it through a performance of the score, he plays other notes. This, it seems to me, is just as non-standard as the hacker's performance. We can understand and indeed applaud what Steyer is doing, but we should recognize that he's flouting another foundational norm of classical work performance, namely to comply with the work's score. This leads us to a second issue, which is that Dodd, of course, disagrees that score compliance is a foundational norm of classical work performance. As I noted earlier, he argues that though we value score compliance, like interpretive insight for its own sake, and it's thus a final value in the practice, we value score compliance, unlike interpretive insight, only under the condition of its instrumentality. That is, because it tends to secure another thing we value for its own sake in the practice, namely understanding musical works. So where they clash, interpretive insight trumps score compliance, and thus Steyer's performance, far from being non-standard, is on the contrary, an embodiment of the practice's most fundamental value. What I want to do now then is raise first an objection to this account of the value of score compliance and a related dilemma for Dodd's account of authentic performance. I've already raised at least the dilemma, I think, in print, in the kind of critical notice of Dodd's book in the British Journal of Aesthetics that I published, but I hope to say more about it here. Another turn of the screw, if you will. So the objection is that it's implausible that we value score compliance only under the condition of its instrumentality. In explaining how score compliance has come to be a final value in the practice, Dodd says that what has happened is this: something that facilitates the successful transmission of understanding of the work has become valued by us for its own sake. Score compliance's status as a final value is determined by the fact that it tends to secure the practice's telos, the deepening of our understanding of the works performed. We've come to value the accurate presentation of works in performance because playing accurately tends to facilitate evincing a profound, subtle, or particularly insightful understanding of the work performed. The last bit in square brackets is still a quotation from Dodd. I've just replaced the pronoun with the thing it stands for. It seems to me that all this underplays the role of scores in the practice. As Dodd himself emphasizes, the practice we're considering is work-focused. But the practice of scoring works did not emerge only for us then to discover that scores are helpful for the successful transmission of understanding works, and thus come to value the accurate presentation of works in performance. On the contrary, the practice of scoring works emerged primarily as a way of preserving or transmitting not the understanding of works, but works themselves. Score compliance doesn't merely tend to secure our understanding of works, it's fundamental to such understanding because the score represents the work in all its detail. It's because of this more fundamental role that scores play in the practice that I defend an alternative view of the fundamental value of the classical work performance tradition. In my view, there's a single final constitutive norm of the practice, namely to evince an understanding of the work by performing it, where such performance requires complying with the score. Dodd, of course, would agree that the constitutive norm of the practice is to evince an understanding of the work by performing it, but he disagrees that this requires compliance with the score. This leads me to a related dilemma for Dodd's account of authentic performance. A performance of one work, say Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, may reveal something about another work, say Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. perhaps something profound about the second work's point. But we wouldn't want to say that the performance of the first work was thereby an authentic performance of the second work. Dodd thus requires a way of restricting what counts as an interpretively authentic but non-score compliant performance of a given work. What he supplies is Stephen Davies' account of work performance. Recall that the essence of that account is that to perform a given work, the performers must intend to follow most of the work determinative instructions in the score and succeed to a suitable degree. Does Steyer's performance of the rondo meet the necessary conditions of this account? Here the dilemma emerges. Let's first suppose that Steyer's performance does meet these conditions. Steyer doesn't aim to comply completely with the score, but perhaps he complies with most of it. The problem for Dodd, as I claimed in the BJA piece, is that this no longer appears to be a case of interpretive authenticity trumping score compliance. If Davies' account of work performance is correct, then this is a score compliant performance after all. So this case and others like it fail to exemplify how interpretive authenticity may trump score compliance. Let's now pursue the other horn of the dilemma. Suppose that Steyer violates enough of the score that he doesn't count as intending to follow most of it. Now, if Dodd's theory of the values of the tradition is correct, we have a case where the value of eliciting understanding of a work has trumped complying with the work's score, but at the cost that the performance no longer meets the necessary conditions on being a performance of the work in question. And if it's not a performance of the work in question, it can't be an authentic performance of it. For what it's worth, Dodd's official view seems to position him on the first horn. Throughout his discussion of this issue, he characterizes the leeway interpretive authenticity gives to score compliance as slight, in terms such as compromising a little, ignoring certain scored instructions here and there, or tinkering with the score. But if interpretive authenticity trumps score compliance, why couldn't it justify more radical departures from the score? The most obvious answer, it seems to me, is that the work, and hence its meaning, is more closely tied to the work's details as represented in the score. In the next section, I focus on that idea. But before we turn to that, it's worth considering a way out of Dodd's dilemma. In his theory of work performance, Dodd appeals to the notion of recognizability. Perhaps this concept can supply the missing constraint on performances being of a given work. This avenue is appealing in part because even some philosophers who disagree with Dodd on authenticity, such as Davies and Gerald Levinson, appeal to recognizability in their theories of work performance. Unfortunately, I believe not only that recognizability can't save Dodd from the problems he faces, but also that Davies and Levinson are mistaken to appeal to recognizability where they do. And I should also say that this is an issue that Nemesio's work in particular has inspired me to think more carefully about. So Davies introduces recognizability as a way of cashing out the necessary condition on work performance that there must be a suitable degree of matching between performance and work. One might intend to follow most or even all of the work determinative instructions in the score of a given work and yet make some mistakes. Davies, like almost all philosophers of music, doesn't want to allow the mistakes to disqualify the performance as the performance of the work. However, if the mistakes and other mishaps are so egregious that the work is no longer recognizable in the resulting performance, it fails to be a performance of the work. If this is the role that recognizability plays in Dodd's theory, then it fails as a solution to the dilemma. Is Mozart's rondo recognizable in Steyer's performance? If so, then assuming it meets the other necessary conditions, it's a score-compliant performance of Mozart's work, and thus no example of interpretive authenticity trumping score compliance. If not, then it isn't a performance of Mozart's work at all. Alternatively, though, Dodd might boost the role of recognizability as a criterion of work performance. Perhaps he could say that as long as a performance is intended to be of a given work, and that work is, as a result, recognizable in it, it qualifies as a performance of the work. This would appear to separate recognizability from score compliance in the qualification of a performance as of a given work, and thus be just what Dodd is looking for, if everything up till now has made sense. The notion of recognizability is largely taken for granted in the literature, but it's far from clear to me what kind of recognizability is being appealed to. So I want to consider three ways of understanding the notion, but unfortunately, I think that any sense of recognizability strong enough to do the job will beg the question of whether the controversial performances we're considering qualify as performances of the works they purport to be of. So first, what we might call identificatory recognition is what happens when you hear a snatch of music on the radio, say, and identify the work it's from. This is a very low bar. If the middle school wind band can manage something resembling the first two bars of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, it will be recognizable in this first sense to any competent listener. But surely if the remainder of the performance is unrecognizable in this sense, it'll be too weak for anyone to employ in a theory of work performance, at least as a kind of roughly sufficient condition. What we might call continuous recognition requires identifying the work in question at every point of the performance. In one respect, this criterion is too strong. Suppose a professional symphony orchestra attempts Beethoven's Fifth and achieves a revelatory performance that is also note perfect, apart from a major meltdown by the principal oboe during the first movement, where they have a big solo. Beethoven's work isn't identifiable in the botched solo, but surely the performance as a whole should count as recognizably of Beethoven's work. So the obvious fix for this problem is to weaken the condition. We should only require that the work be identifiable at most points of the performance, let's say. There's something inevitably vague about that, but we've already got vagueness in the theory of work performance we're dealing with, so maybe that's not a problem. In another respect, however, this criterion is too weak. If the middle school band decide to put their best foot forward and perform only the first two bars of their arrangement of Beethoven's Fifth, their performance will meet this criterion. That work is recognizable throughout their short performance. But surely we don't want that to count as a performance of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So, what we might call complete recognition solves this problem by requiring that a competent listener identify every part or aspect of the work in the performance and nothing additional. We'll still have to kind of weaken and vaguify it in the same way as the previous criterion, right? We're only going to be able to require the audience to be able to identify most parts or aspects of the work in the performance and not many additional things. And presumably we'll want to require only that a competent listener could recognize most parts or aspects if they paid attention to them. We don't want to appeal, if we can avoid it, to some kind of superhuman listener. But that's okay. It's plausible that this notion of complete recognition counts purported performances of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony that use horns rather than bassoons in the second fanfare, as indeed performances of that work. But what about Steyer's purported performance of Mozart's Rondo alla Turca? What makes that performance controversial is that some apparently competent listeners respond to it with comments such as, wow, that was really great. It's not exactly Mozart's Rondo, but it's a fascinating fantasia on that movement. These listeners don't recognize enough of Mozart's work, or perhaps too much additional stuff, in Steyer's performance to count it as a performance of that work. Dodd will disagree with these judgments, of course, but he doesn't seem able to refute them by appealing to recognizability without begging the question. So, appealing more robustly to recognizability as a criterion of work performance won't save Dodd from the dilemma. I've covered a lot of ground in the last three sections, so let me do a quick recap. Dodd appeals to the notion of a work's point or overall significance in arguing that performances that flout score compliance in favor of evincing understanding are thereby no less authentic performances of the works they purport to be of. I've argued that score compliance is more fundamental than Dodd suggests, and that his demotion of it to the second tier of value in the practice presents him with a dilemma. Either the controversial performances he uses to illustrate the view are not examples of interpretive authenticity trumping score compliance, or they're not performances of the works they purport to be of after all. The dilemma Dodd faces is one more reason to prefer my alternative view of the normative profile of classical work performance, namely that there's a single constitutive norm of the practice to evince an understanding of the work through complying with its score. You may have noticed, though, that this might require a superhuman listener as well. But anyway, you might have noticed that for all I've said thus far, it seems that, like Davies, I'm committed to the implication that the controversial performances of Beethoven's Fifth, at least, are in fact authentic performances of the work, because they meet Davies' vague conditions on work performance. It's not clear to me whether Steyer's performance of the Mozart is an authentic performance of Mozart's rondo on this view of performance of Davies that Dodd endorses. Perhaps it's right in the vague spot in terms of how score compliant it is, right? Whether it matches the score enough to a suitable degree. Now, perhaps we could develop a theory of recognizability further to deal with this. However, unlike Dodd, I don't accept Davies' theory of work performance. It seems to me that a better way to accommodate the notion that an authentic work performance may include mistakes is simply to require that the performer reasonably intend to comply with the score. Such intentions can be defeated in all sorts of ways, but that's irrelevant to whether the work is being performed. As I've written elsewhere, this obviates the need for a matching condition altogether, since there'll be very few, perhaps no cases where a reasonable intention to perform a work fails to result in such matching. And the unintuitiveness of those cases, if any, is easily explained by the theory. This theory also allows me, unlike Davies, to explain why cases such as the reorchestration of Beethoven's Fifth don't count as authentic performances, even though their departures from the score are arguably minor. Of course, there's an intuitive cost to the theory, which Julian's put a lot of weight on. We typically ignore small intentional departures from the score when making judgments of what work has been performed, like we put Beethoven's Fifth Symphony on the cover of that CD. But no theory of musical works and performances can avoid some such cost. Like others, of course, I believe that my preferred theory comes out ahead when the cost-benefit analysis is completed. And I'll say a little bit more about this right at the end. So how does all of this relate to the notion of a work's musical meaning? Dodd emphasizes that the controversial performance decisions he discusses are motivated by the same concern that motivates many excellent, uncontroversial, because score-compliant performances. Namely, the desire to communicate to the audience why the piece is as it is or unfolds as it does. Its overall character, integrity, significance, or point. What matters in the presentation of that work and performance, and so on. These are all phrases Dodd uses to characterize musical meaning throughout the book. But it's not entirely clear what relationship Dodd sees between these things and a work's musical meaning. At one point, at least, he seems to identify the two, saying that, quote, the meaning of a work is the significance or point undergirding its being as it is. But this is surely too strong, at least if we give it a strong reading. Maybe it's sort of ambiguous. Even if we acknowledge the impossibility of paraphrasing a work's point, and can somehow specify it more narrowly than such phrases as, little ethnic showpiece, two quite different works could surely share the same point. The obvious response to this objection is that the work's overall point, significance, or whatever we want to call it, is only one part or aspect of the work's musical meaning, albeit an important one. Another part or aspect is the work's details. And Dodd does seem to tie the work's point essentially to such details. When he says things like, quote, the meaning of a work is the significance or point undergirding its being as it is, presumably the as it is here refers to the different notes, melodies, harmonies, rhythms, instruments, and so on that individuate two works, even if they have the same kind of general point. But this highlights a tension in Dodd's text. In a couple of places, he says that within classical work performance practice, quote, performers are enjoined to bring to the surface a deeper level of musical content that is not itself specified by the notation, end quote. But he also says that, quote, the deep level of content with which he's concerned is there in the notes, but only makes itself manifest to someone with the wherewithal to engage with the work interpretively in a rich, sophisticated style. Now, I don't mean to be playing a cheap game of like catching Dodd in a superficial contradiction here. The notion of musical meaning, beyond not only the surface detail of a piece, but also beyond the deeper level of its formal structure, say, is maddeningly difficult to pin down. We want to say, as Dodd does, that such meaning is there in the work, in the notes, for a suitably sophisticated and insightful interpreter to discover, and yet it's something quite different from the notes, right? So this is what's, I think, being communicated by this, superficial contradiction. As Stephen Davies says, in an essay on descriptive or critical rather than performative musical interpretation, quote, "The fullest explanation of the music's progress must take account of its spiritual content." Davies calls this a more demanding and yet crucial task than those taken on by most critical interpreters, since it tries to address what is so humanly compelling and impressive about great musical works. So again, Davies disagrees with Dodd about authenticity, but he seems to be right together with him in acknowledging the importance of this deep musical content. Though I can't pretend to have anything close to a full theory of the meaning of musical works, I will end by trying to argue that such meaning is tied so closely to the details of the work as scored that interpretive insight can't justify the claim that a score-flouting performance is an authentic performance of the work it purports to be of, no matter how valuable it might be, even in providing insight into the work in question. I'm going to attempt to make my case in 3 ways. So although I said, I'm going to end with this, it's going to be a long coda. So I want to investigate 2 kinds of musical practice related to these issues. And then I also want to draw an analogy with literary works. So I've already discussed how Steyer's interpretation of the Rondo alla Turca leads him to depart quite radically from the score, and why I think the result is not an authentic performance of Mozart's work. But other examples don't rely on the notion that cultural distance between composer and audience prevents communication of the work's point. Consider the example of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony once more. Suppose that Herbert von Karajan, knowing Beethoven's score inside out, infers, let's say reasonably for the sake of argument, though I would disagree, that Beethoven assigned the fanfare introducing the second theme group and the recapitulation of the first movement to bassoons rather than horns, because the horn technology available to him did not allow him to assign it to the horns, as he would have preferred. Beethoven wanted to give it to the horns, but he couldn't because of the way horns were back then, so he gives it to the bassoons instead. What's bugging Karajan, in other words, is that a contingent historical detail about horn technology prevented Beethoven from perfectly realizing the intended character of this moment in the piece, and perhaps as a result, muddying the structure of the movement. And the character of such moments, along with structure and its relative clarity, contribute to the musical meaning of the work, or are parts of it. But there's something puzzling about claiming that one can correct this problem by reorchestrating the fanfare. Let me present it as another dilemma, although unfortunately now they're going to be like the horns of the dilemma. Maybe I'll do this for horns of the dilemma. And of course the horns that, that they're playing in the orchestra. So sorry about that. But it's Julian's fault, it was his example. So on the first horn of the dilemma, reorchestrating the fanfare does not alter the musical meaning of what's performed. This seems like a non-starter. If the reorchestration doesn't change the musical meaning of the performance, then how could it solve the problem that was bugging Karajan in the first place? On the second horn of the dilemma, reorchestrating the fanfare does alter the musical meaning of what's performed. The problem here is that if X has a different musical meaning from Y, it seems that X and Y can't be the same work. So Karajan isn't authentically performing the work he purports to be. There are various ways one might try to take the edge off the second horn of the dilemma. First, of course, 2 quite different but uncontroversially authentic performances of a given work can have different musical meanings. That's one of the joys of performable musical works. So it's not true that if X and Y have different musical meanings, they can't be the same work. Because performable works are thinner than their performances, they allow for a range of musical meanings to be conveyed by their authentic performances. However, if this is what's going on in the case in question, the implication is that Beethoven's work is thinner than we thought, at least thinner than I thought. His scoring of the second fanfare for bassoons turns out to be like bowings in the violin parts, mere recommendations and not work determinative. I doubt that Dodd would want to go this way, at least. It sounds a little bit like Nemesio's view, actually. But it's inconsistent with other things Dodd says about the nature of works and performances. And if it were correct, it would mean, once more, that Karajan's performance is score compliant. So it wouldn't be an example of what Julian's presenting it as an example of. A second way to take the edge off the second horn is to argue that there's a kind of tension in the musical meaning of the movement. At the surface level, the 2 fanfares have quite different meanings, because of the character of their instruments. But at a deeper level, the two fanfares should have a very similar meaning. The second is, after all, a recapitulation of the first. Faced with this tension, any performer must make a decision. Either you slight the deeper structural meaning by sticking with Beethoven's orchestration, or you slight the surface meaning by reassigning the second fanfare to the horns. The second way of understanding the situation reminds me of another of Dodd's cases. Alfred Brendel believes that in some of Beethoven's keyboard works, it's impossible to respect both the tempo that Beethoven mandates and the details of his melodic lines. Brendel believes that the details are more important to the work's meaning than the tempo, and thus ignores the latter. I've argued elsewhere that the Brendel case doesn't help Dodd establish his view, since in cases where a work requires something impossible, a plausible theory of score compliance could require at most only that one perform the possibility closest to what the score requires, taking into account such matters as the apparent musical meaning of the work. Thus, Brendel doesn't violate score compliance in ignoring Beethoven's prescribed tempo. So even if the Kania case is like the Brendel case, it isn't obvious that it's a case of interpretive authenticity trumping score compliance. But the Kania case is not like the Brendel case. Recall that I said that at the surface level, the two fanfares have a quite different meaning because of the character of their instruments, but at a deeper level, they should have a very similar meaning because of their structural role. I used the word should advisedly at that point. Does the second fanfare have a very similar meaning to the first because of its structural role? Surely what makes this an interesting interpretive question, and precisely what's bugging Kania, right, is that the different orchestration of the fanfares somewhat undercuts their structural role, right? The second one's as a recapitulation of the first one. To claim that the two fanfares should be more similar than they are in the score strikes me as not a descriptive interpretive claim about Beethoven's work, but rather a normative counterfactual claim about how that work might have been different. So what Karian's doing, it seems to me, is performing most, indeed almost all, of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, but intentionally performing something else in place of one aspect of one part of it, which results in a performance with a slightly different musical meaning than any authentic performance of Beethoven's Fifth could have. You'll misunderstand Beethoven's Fifth, albeit only slightly or in part, if you think that Karian's performance conveys throughout its span musical meaning implicit in the work. These considerations should also give us pause when considering claims that a particular departure from the score is minor or mere tinkering. So this is a place where I feel like, I would have liked to mention this earlier. I haven't quite figured out the ideal structure of this paper. But anyway, the point is, this example highlights how a superficially small change, for instance, to a small number of notes or to a single aspect of a short passage like orchestration, how such a small change can, depending on the role of the passage in the work as a whole, make a big difference to the meaning of the work or performance. If Dodd really means to restrict departures from the score to minor ones, he'll have to explain whether he means this in a superficial or a deep sense. If it's the superficial sense, then the claim seems to require further justification, as I discussed earlier. Why shouldn't interpretive authenticity justify radical departures from the score? If it's the deep sense, it's again less clear whether the example of Beethoven's Fifth respects his theory, since now it looks like the departure has a significant impact on the meaning of the performance, right? It's making this deep change to the musical meaning of the performance. And thus it's not kind of mere tinkering or a small change. We can approach these same issues from the perspective of composers rather than performers. Complex musical works don't spring fully formed from the brows of even the most godlike composers. Rather, composers sweat over the large-scale structure of their works, the fine details of their works, and everything in between. Much of this work is hidden from the view of audiences and performers, but it often becomes visible at the final stages of composition when the composer modifies a work in progress after hearing a rehearsal or performance of it. There are also many cases of composers altering completed works much later, thus producing what are commonly called different versions of the same work. Dodd also mentions the much less common occurrence of a composer altering a work to reflect some of the more convincing performances of them. All these practices raise thorny metaphysical questions, like whether musical works are the kinds of things that can be changed. If so, how we should, if not, how we should strictly speaking describe these cases, and so on. But happily, I don't think we need to address these metaphysical issues here. As I've written elsewhere, a natural way to understand all of these cases, no matter what their metaphysical underpinnings, is as the composer's modifying the score or work to better reflect the meaning or content she intends or intended to convey through the work. But if Dodd's right about classical practice, a composer might just as well refrain from modifying the score in cases like these. For knowledgeable performers will be able to see, through careful study of the original score, the meaning the composer is attempting to convey, and will or should feel free to depart from the score the better to reflect this meaning. The fact that composers do not refrain from modifying their scores, that on the contrary, they take pains to modify those scores' smallest details, suggests that they understand such changes as modifying the content of their works, since that content is determined by the score in all its detail. Dodd might reply that since scores are the only means composers have in this practice to communicate their musical meanings, it's no surprise that they're concerned with creating scores that communicate those meanings as clearly and accurately as possible. Compare people writing philosophical papers. Many of us also take pains over details, such as whether to enclose a phrase in parentheses, commas, or dashes. In one strict metaphysical sense, these differences might be said to make for different papers. But it might seem extreme to say that they make for papers with different philosophical meanings. So the fact that composers sweat over the details maybe doesn't show that those details affect the work's meaning. But I think this analogy, which I should emphasize is mine, not Dodd's, is misleading. Whatever the sense in which the philosophical meaning of a paper is a function of the details of its text, the musical meaning of a work is a quite different function of the details of its score. The details of a musical score arguably matter much more than the details of a philosophical text. I can't do better here really than Stephen Davies in making the basic point through a literary analogy. He writes that in literature, the work cannot be replaced by a paraphrase in modern speak, in literature, right? So this is where the difference with philosophy perhaps makes a big difference. One can paraphrase Jonathan Swift, Davies says, but one loses his work of art in doing so. What goes for literature applies yet more clearly to music. Composers have something to say, but because what they say has no independently specifiable semantic content, it can be successfully communicated only in their own accents and idiolects, even if these are local to a particular time and place. It is the sounds of the instruments they knew and for which they wrote, as much as the syntax of their musical expression, that capture the tonal nuances of their utterances. Davies' concern in this particular passage is with period instruments in particular, but I believe his point applies more broadly to all the details of a work as scored. And his reasoning appeals to the very aspects of musical meaning that Dodd has so clearly articulated. In particular, its non-propositional, or as Davies would say, non-semantic, non-paraphrasable nature. So let me conclude with one more literary analogy. I've tried this one out before and been chastised by all and sundry for ignoring a fundamental ontological difference between music and literature. But I will try to explain here why I think that that difference doesn't undermine the analogy. There's a famous critical dispute about whether Henry James's Turn of the Screw is a ghost story, in the sense that its fictional world contains ghosts, a psychological thriller in which the ghosts are really hallucinations of the governess and there aren't really any ghosts in the fictional world, or ambiguous between the first two interpretations. Suppose that we're in the position to issue a new edition of the story and that we're convinced that the psychological thriller interpretation is the best. That is, we're convinced, let us suppose for good reason, that a large part of the meaning of the work, its overall point or significance, you might say, is the notion that the governess is hallucinating and there are no ghosts. The widely acknowledged sticking point for this interpretation is a passage immediately following the governess's second experience of a ghost. She describes him in some detail to the long-serving housekeeper, who identifies him as Peter Quint, the former valet. The problem, for our preferred interpretation, is that the governess has never seen Peter Quint, nor heard a description of his appearance. Thus, it would be a staggering coincidence if she happened to hallucinate a ghost who looked quite specifically like him. But of course, the passage in question is a small part of the text, and here we are in the position of editors of that text. We thus resolve that in order to be faithful to the work's meaning, its overall point or significance, we should make a few modest changes to the text. We could pare down both the detail of the governess's description of the ghost and the certainty of the housekeeper's initial identification, or we could insert some subtle suggestions that the governess has likely heard a physical description of Quint. Or presumably there's a bunch of other ways we could do the same thing. Surely our new edition of The Turn of the Screw would be roundly rejected by lovers of literature, whatever their interpretations of the tale. The problem is that no matter what our beliefs about the overall point or significance of the work, we all acknowledge that its surface details are equally essential to the particular meaning it has as a work of art. We might, of course, argue that James did not quite succeed in what he attempted, or that he would have done better to attempt something different. And we might preface our new edition of the work with a clear explanation of what we've done and why. But this will only increase the obviousness that what we have done is not to present an authentic instance of the work, but to alter it. The fundamental ontological difference between this case and the musical cases, of course, is that literary works are not for performance, while musical works are. Musical works call for performative interpretation, while the sort of editorial interpretation that I've just discussed is so non-standard that we don't even have an established term for it. But I don't see that this makes a difference with respect to the issues that we're currently concerned with. When we get the turn of the screw out of the library, we expect to receive an accurate instance of the work. We don't care from the point of view of appreciating James's work about the cover art or the choice of font. But we expect to get a faithful copy of the text, since only through that can we hope to access the literary meaning of the work through experiencing the work itself. When we attend to a performance of the Rondo alla Turca or Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, by contrast, we might say that we hope to get more than the work in some sense. We hope to hear an we hope to hear an insightful interpretation of it. But as Dodd acknowledges, such interpretations bring out meaning that is already there in the work. So it would be more accurate to say not that we hope to get more than the work, but rather that we hope to get more than merely the notes, more than merely the superficial layer of meaning, you might say. We hope to hear something of the work's deeper meaning, but we still expect to get a faithful instance of the work, since it's only through such instances that we can hope to access the musical meaning of the work through experiencing the work. Apart from recapitulating his arguments for his views of musical work performance and interpretive authenticity, Dodd himself objects to this analogy by arguing that there's a crucial difference between the literary and musical cases. He says, while a novel's readers are supposed to interpret it in reading it, the work they interpret is the end product of the artistic process. This is why they're not sanctioned to amend the work's text in interpreting it. All the artistic work is over by the time readers get hold of it. But a performer interprets the musical work she performs in the process of producing the artistic end product, the work's realization in sound. It's precisely because the performer, in this sense, enters into artistic collaboration with the composer that the space opens up for performers to decide occasionally to abandon ideal textual fidelity for the sake of making better sense of the work performed. There's clearly a sense in which Dodd is right that the artistic endpoint of a composition of a work for performance is the work's realization in sound. We couldn't make sense of the practice of composing such works without understanding that they are for performance. But we must also recognize that the musical work is itself a finished artwork, like a novel, with a meaning impervious to what performers may do with it. Now, you might, of course, disagree with that. You might be a constructivist about the meanings of musical works. That would be a different discussion. I'm taking it as common ground between Julian and myself that musical works have their meanings. And these are revealed in performances. But that means we simply returned to the issues I discussed earlier, right? Issues about the nature of the work, how it constrains performances, what role meaning has, and how it's manifested in works, and so on. So I think the literary analogy is helpful. I don't think it's undermined by the ontological difference between two art forms, but ultimately I think it depends on the earlier arguments. So I fear that it's easy to get the impression from what I've said that I abhor performances such as those of Karian and Steyer, purporting to present Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and Mozart's Rondo alla Turca. That impression would be wholly incorrect. These performances are compelling, not least for the very reason Dodd admires them. They help us to understand those works. But not everything that helps us understand a work, not even every such thing that might ordinarily be described by competent audience members as a performance of a given work, is in fact, let alone thereby, a performance of that work. In musical, as opposed to philosophical settings, we commonly refer to fragments, arrangements, and even travesties of a work by the name of the work itself. In philosophical settings, we criticize such talk as, strictly speaking, inaccurate, as we attempt to construct consistent theories of those practices. What I've tried to argue today is that we should say something similar about the purported authenticity of performances such as Karajan's and Steyer's. With a clear view of the relationships between musical works, their meanings, and performances of them, we can understand why people might ordinarily refer to those performances as authentic instances of Beethoven's and Mozart's works. But on philosophical reflection, we should acknowledge that they are not that, despite their great musical value. Thanks.
Okay. Sorry. Every time I switch on my microphone, then creates echo. Thank you, Andrew. That was wonderful, very provocative too, I think. I mean, I think we have a lot to discuss, especially the last analogy with literature, it's not, it's, issue for discussion. So I think we can start the discussion finally. And we have, the main representative position you discuss here, which is Julian. And so I guess that, let's open the discussion.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me, Andrew?
Yep.
You can hear me, yeah? Yep. Great. Thanks very much. Here's something to start, I suppose. I mean, which isn't necessarily an objection to anything you've said, but I think maybe brings out the nature of the disagreement. It was that bit where, the point where you said composers produce scores to aid the transmission of the works through time. And I think that's where the deep disagreement lies, because I think that's where we part company. Because I think that composers produce scores to fix, as it were, the identity of the works, which are then given over to performers to interpret, on the understanding that interpretation can sometimes lead to departures from particular scored instructions. So I think that's the nature of the disagreement, really. It's about what and I guess my feeling, I mean, it might only be a feeling, is that kind of transmission model for making sense of scores without, as it were, transmission being in the service of something else, which is understanding the works. My concern, it's a very kind of inchoate concern. My concern is that kind of picture always brings in interpretation in performance too late. That's my worry, that it always seems something of an afterthought. And so, I mean, that's a feeling that I've had reading kind of Stephen's stuff on this, where it seems to me that a performer is kind of like a sonic postman, and then interpretation interpretation enters the scene because the score's gappy. Whereas, as it were, I think a more satisfying view of this is that interpretation is built into the very concept of works of music via their scores. Because as you said, you know, I think one of the things that I say is that works in that sense invite interpretation. So I think that's just a way of characterizing the disagreement. It isn't to kind of object to anything you've said, but that might be its deep locus. That's not a question, it's just an observation, but I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds plausible as a sort of a diagnosis of the disagreement. I think it's, I'd have to go back and look now. I think it's a misunderstanding of, or an uncharitable interpretation of, well, that makes it sound a little bit harsh, but I think the idea that in Stephen's view, gee, it's lucky for us that scores underdetermined or works underdetermined performances because, wow, look, it turns out that like it makes interpretation possible. It's like, no, yeah, of course, that would be a weird thing to say, that the whole kind of tradition developed in this way, that these two things kind of came along together. I suppose what I might lean on in response to just sort of getting started, or what I'd like to hear your thoughts on, are things like, composers sweating over the details of the scores, right? It seems like, how does one explain that if it's not that the score is supposed to constrain performances of the work? You might say, well, my understanding is you'll say something like, well, they're creating the work, they're setting down conditions for an accurate performance. But then accurate performance doesn't really sort of play any role in the theory. But then why would composers be so concerned to kind of set down the precise rules for accurate performance if that's not what you're supposed to do with these things?
Well, I guess. Let's wait for the echo to go. Well, I mean, Nemesio might want to comment at this point. I mean, my thought would be that they want to fix the identity of the work that is there to be interpreted, which is what the score does. But there is an understanding that the role of the performer is to evince meaning in performance, and that might lead to occasional infractions from the score. So, I think most performers would say that, they're working with a medium to kind of create things with meaning. Sometimes, their control of the medium is not perfect. So it might be that there's that we want to kind of embody a certain meaning in a work. Certain scored instructions might fail to pull that off. That's an understanding of the process of composition. And so rather like if a theatre company is rehearsing a play, an actor might say, look, Mr. Playwright or Mrs. Playwright, or even indeed Ms. Playwright, my character wouldn't say that. I'm going to depart from that. So I see, what we've got going on here is something similar. Of course, the score identifies the work, but the work is then, again, I've said it already, I'm just repeating myself, it's handed over to performers to interpret. And that interpretation, trying to bring out that meaning, might, performers might reasonably think that occasional missteps by the composer with the medium have led to a failure to fully embody or fully bring out that meaning in the score. Just like my character wouldn't say that response by an actor.
And so what about then the notion of like why is it just tinkerings? I mean, would you be prepared to say that, at least in a philosopher's sense, it would be possible that this could underwrite an extremely radical departure from the score? It's unlikely to happen in practice because most composers know what they're doing largely, right? And as you say, they're mostly going to misstep in the details. But could there in principle be a case where it's like a radical reworking of the piece?
Right.
would in fact count, despite what most people might initially think, as an authentic performance of the piece.
Right. So I think this might be another difference. So I think that the question of this picture, well, let me put it like this. Here's what I'm interested in. The case where performers think that they're torn two ways in performing a work. And you know, Brendel puts that quite nicely. I know you dispute that case. And then there's the question of giving a necessary and sufficient conditions for work performance. Now, so I'm interested in the former case. I'm not interested in the latter. I'm really interested in the case in which someone is performing a work, but deciding to depart in certain places from the score. So some of the cases that you're mentioning here, and you're describing, you know, where somebody is really driven by interpretive authenticity in performing a certain work, they might cross that line, wherever that line is, and cease to count as performing that work. I think, you know, of course. So a really radical Andreas Steyer, I'm prepared to accept. I mean, if you know, I think Walterstorff said this, that, you know, that you have to obey enough of the scored instructions to count as performing the work. So it could be that somebody sets out as a performer to intend to perform the work, sacrificing some score compliance for the sake of bringing out greater interpretive authenticity. And yet they might cross that line, and in the end we'll decide actually what you've done is you're performing a kind of a fantasia, of course. But I think that the kinds of cases that I'm describing, maybe the Steyer is on the border. It's one of the more extreme ones. But the kind of cases that seem to me to be very everyday in the practice are where nobody in the concert hall, nobody in the rehearsal hall thinks that they're doing anything other than performing the work. And yet they've made a decision to depart from certain scored instructions. They're the very familiar cases. And I think that what was driving you know, the thinking in that book was that, well, we have to have an account that kind of makes sense of that.
Yeah, I just don't see that you can. I don't see that any of us engaged in this debate can sort of say. It seems very strange to me to say. I'm interested in these cases where you feel a tension. It's like you want to perform the work, but you want to kind of disobey the little aspects of the score because of those sorts of reasons, right? But I'm not really interested in kind of this line between performance and non-performance, because it seems like the whole debate, nobody should be saying, look, people who make disco versions of Beethoven should be shot, right? They're saying, look, you can do a disco version of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, but don't fool yourself into thinking that's really a performance of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Now, of course, the people doing the disco tracks probably wouldn't say that, right?
So here's the reply.
That seems like, look, you can convey aspects of the profound meaning of a work without performing it.
Agreed.
The issue is precisely, it seems to me, right? Did you, in trying to convey meaning of a work by producing a musical performance, thereby actually perform the work, or did you do something else that conveyed, you know, in a musical performance? Okay. It's easy to get the two confused, of course, in, you know, outside the philosophy room, because you think, well, it's a musical performance, it sounds like Beethoven's Fifth, so it must be a performance of Beethoven's Fifth. But once you're engaged in these issues, it's like you can't say I'm interested in authentic performance and I'm not that interested in what counts as a performance of a work. Well, it seems to me. I mean, again,
so my response is, I'm interested enough for the question that I'm really interested in to make sense. And what I'm trying to do is to make sense of those cases where performers say, I want to be true to this work. I want to, I think I'm digging out the meaning and being true to the work in that sense. And yet by doing that, there's a tension with full score compliance.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's starting with the phenomenon, which is that you've got musicians everywhere thinking that what they're doing is departing from the score, not for the sake of playing a part of the work or playing a different work rather than playing it all, but for the sake of bringing out understanding of that work. So that's the question I'm interested in. And I think I'm kind of interested enough in the question about what it, kind of necessary and sufficient conditions for performing a work, for that to allow me to focus on what I'm interested in. And I think it's those cases that are really, really important and are kind of interesting here, because it seems as if the performers involved are kind of, as it were, normatively conflicted. It's why it can take a heck of a long time for a conductor to look through a score and work out what to do with it. Why, Mahler conducting Bruckner agonizes over whether to cut bits or whether to kind of change bits, because he's not doing this for fun. He's not departing from the score for fun. He thinks that there's a way of performing that work, of getting it right while still performing that work, which brings out something more of the meaning. And I think that's, so what I'm trying to do is to, however badly, is to do justice to that phenomenon. And of course, and I'm prepared to accept, of course, that in that process, one might go to such an extent departed from the score that one will bring into question whether one's performing that work at all.
Yeah.
But that question of what counts as score, what counts as performing the work, the necessary and sufficient conditions question about what it is to perform that work. I think there's a sense in which it has to be held in suspension, because it is a distinct question from the question of, okay, once we all agree that on any sensible account of what is required to perform a work, there seem to be these cases where performers depart from full score compliance for the sake, not of personal authenticity or any kind of trivial means, but to kind of bring out the meaning of the work.
Yeah,
that's it.
Well, can I have one more go then? Sorry, I want to exclude everyone else from this conversation, but it's useful to bring up the cases again and like what's motivating you. I suppose one way this is, obviously I'm just trying transparently to sort of trap you in something you don't want to say, but I know maybe you do want to say this. Suppose everyone reads your book, like the musicians. It seems like if they really take it on board, right, it turns out it's correct, they see what's correct about it, then going forward, it seems like Brendel, Karian, etc., right, they should no longer feel that tension, because what you've shown is no, it makes total sense what you've been doing all along, because interpretable authenticity is the most fundamental norm. It trumps score compliance, so you don't need to worry about that. You can see how, right, it might seem like, well, that's a bit weird, right? Maybe my view where those two things are on a level kind of explains the tension better. And if we want to capture what's going on in the practice, right, we want those two norms to be on a par, because that would explain why people feel this tension so strongly. And even after they made these decisions, they might kind of wonder whether they've done the right thing. But yeah, would you be happy with a future where the tension is no longer felt because everyone realizes that no, it's okay to abandon score compliance?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think I would be happy with that. I think that the tension is there, perhaps because I think it's an interesting question. The tension is there because of a kind of because of an incomplete conception of the normative structure of the practice, right? And also, so you've got this value, which is score compliance, which is a final value, right? And it makes performers think twice, more than twice, about departing from the score. So perhaps if people did read, this antecedent looks like it's impossible. If lots of musicians were going to read my book, then it might be that they're less worried by that and freed up to what I think is kind of explore interesting interpretive options that might be good at bringing out the meaning of the works they're performing. just to throw into the pot here, one thing that might just be driving this, the longevity of this tension is just straightforward score fetishism. I mean, we just think, gosh, this is, this is a language. This is like a language we just got to obey, as it were. And it's a special language, a score. So departing from the score has to be always a bad thing. I don't know. I mean, but I think you're right. I mean, but as things stand at the moment, it seems to me that many performers report themselves as feeling conflicted. And of course, the other thing in the pot is, sorry, this is the final thing. The other thing in the pot is the question of whether a departure from the score really does bring out the meaning of the work better is moot. It's going to involve artistic judgment. And so, of course, people are going to be hesitant about doing that. For the kinds of, for the kinds of reasons I talk about in the book, things can go pear-shaped very quickly. Yeah. That's me.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful.
Hi, Andrew.
Thank you very much
for your talk. And well, to go also into this point of the.
I think somebody, maybe Julian, has to turn off his speakers or something. I'm getting 16 Nemesios.
Switch off. Yes. Yeah. Right.
This is exciting.
Right. Can you hear me better now, Andrew?
Yeah, that's good.
Yes, I cannot hear now.
Sorry, because every time Andrew speaks, you have to switch. So it's, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Right. So just in order to reinforce the idea of the point of disagreement between defending just one norm or defending two fundamental norms in work performance, and having to do with the role that scores play in work performance. So you reinforce it a lot, the idea that the role of a score is to transmit the works. Right. I think that this is right, but not only to transmit the work, but also they transmit the work, they do not transmit the work like a recording, for instance. So they transmit the work in another sense. They are addressed to performers. And in this sense, they invite to a certain interpretation. So the composer himself is trying to produce something that makes sense in performance. And in the way he writes a score, he can write it in in a measure that is 2/2 or 2/4, or writing it in different manners. And it suggests a certain interpretation. So it is not just the role of a score to transmit the word, but to suggest a certain interpretation, because the idea is not just to transmit certain sounds, but to make sense of those sounds. And our idea is that working in a musical medium that is objective, although response dependent, in doing so, in trying to specify the work in the score, the composer may file here and there, and Mahler himself says that, well, Beethoven was not so experienced in conducting orchestra that he may file to write this line in order to achieve this kind of effect or to achieve this meaning. So when reading the score, a conductor can find this. And this is one of the points of disagreement. So the score has to identify the word, but the score also suggests an interpretation, because the final idea of the composer is to produce something that makes sense, and that is something beyond that, exactly the notes that are specified in the score. So this is our idea. And then you can find this, a conductor like Mahler can find, oh, right, Beethoven is trying to do that, but well, he's not so experienced in orchestral technique as to find the right way to write it in the score. And then Mahler is trying to perform that work, that particular work. I'm thinking about, for instance, Beethoven's Nine. He's trying to perform that particular work, not an arrangement, but to try to deal with this. And this is the way in which the score demands one thing, but you are reading the score and the work is demanding to depart slightly in this part. And here is where we find that, well, this explanation of normative conflict can be better than just reducing to one norm and trying to perform a slightly different work.
I mean, just just to get hold of the note, sorry. Just to get hold of the notion of normative conflict here. I mean, so for example, what I'm recommending in the resolution of such conflict is a bit like this. So people may feel normative conflict between the concerns for their family life and their kind of professional life. So, you know, someone may be offered that brilliant job at Harvard, but would have to leave their family behind. They really care about their family. It's fair to describe that as genuine normative conflict, although I think, right, definitely people in that position should put their family life first. And so my recommendation is a bit like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is where I want to reach for those analogies with non-performance art forms. This notion of like, yeah, people grapple with the medium and maybe they don't understand the medium as well as they would have hoped to, and they find that they haven't communicated what they meant to in the medium. This just sounds like it happens to novelists and filmmakers and everyone, right? And because those aren't, you know, and obviously these people are trying to communicate deeper meanings. It's not like they're just like, you know, writing a bunch of words or something. In those media, it's much simpler, right? Because they're not performance media, to see, oh yeah, when Ridley Scott releases a new version of Blade Runner, even though people might not talk about it in this way, it seems
just report, I've never seen Blade Runner.
Oh, well, I won't give you the spoilers then. There are scenes that were shot when he made the film, right, that were not included in the film as originally released, I think because of studio pressures. But then later on, right, he gets to do his director's cut. And it seems like, look, it's obvious what's going on here, right? It's like he made this work under certain constraints. It wasn't exactly the way he would have liked to do it. So later on, he produces what philosophers would say is, right, a different work or a different version of the same work, right? We've got two different films. And if you're talking about Blade Runner, you've got to talk about whether you're talking about the original version or the director's cut. You get cases where actually people think, look, the original version's a lot better, despite what Ridley Scott thinks or whatever, right? You know, it's more ambiguous than the director's cut. I think because it seems to me that musical works are like this. They've got these deep meanings because of, you know, the surface level details, right? The surface level details somehow like project these meanings. They can have meanings that the composer didn't intend, right? I mean, I'm not sure about the musical work suggests an interpretation. I mean, it's true that the composer might have an interpretation in mind, but quite often these musical works can have meanings that composers were not aware of, that are only discovered by insightful performers, right? The idea is that the meaning is there in the work, and different performances can bring out different aspects of the meaning. If you change the work, as it were, right? If you give the second fanfare to the horns instead of the bassoons, you basically do it. It's not the director's cut in this case, but it's like Karajan's cut of Beethoven's Fifth. It's a very similar work, and there are very good reasons for doing it this way. I just think that, you know, when we take all of these things into consideration, it makes more sense to say that this is not a fully authentic performance of Beethoven's Fifth, for the same reason it makes sense to say this edition of The Turn of the Screw is not an authentic, not completely authentic to the work, because it, you know, it's changed some of the words, and those are essential to instances of the work. Performances are instances of musical works, it seems to me, and composers take care of the details of their scores, because the scores are what constrain performances, and thus determine the meaning that the work has, and that it can, and the meanings it can have in performance, if you like. Sorry, I feel like I lost the thread a bit at the end there, but hopefully enough of that was clear.
Right, but for me, it's not quite, also because sometimes when you say, well, it's Karajan's boy, right, it's Karajan's boy, but it is not a question of something personal by Karajan, because there is a normative space in work performance, right, that, well, but you may prefer, and some conductors may prefer a kind of departures and other not. So you may agree where some, for instance, sorry, fine? Okay, right. Sorry, for instance, in cases like these departures of Mahler that Mahler did from Beethoven's original score, they were criticized, and Mahler was said to be too long in these departures. But other conductors like Wagner were followed by several important conductors like Mahler himself, but also Furtwängler and the like. So it seems that there is a normative space in work performance in which this is allowed to perform the work and to try to get or to be true to the content of the work. But anyway, this is to insist in the same thing, and we would like to offer a response in our talk, in the talk this afternoon, about how musical meaning is configured and how this, well, fits this approach and explains how this is possible. But I would like to discuss one thing, because I have a different approach to Steyer's performance. I think that it is not an extreme case. Because I admit that there is a threshold there when you are performing the work, or you are performing a different work when you are departing so much. But in the case of Steyer, my analysis is different. If we hear Steyer's performance with the score, we can see that there are several repetitions of in that work, in the rondo, of the same melody, and we can see that Steyer's is historically informed doing that performance, because he's being strictly score compliant the first time is played one of the passage, and he is doing the variations the second time is repeated, and he's following an historical practice. So he's being compliant in this part of the score, and he's maybe putting in an extreme or exaggerating the conventions of the time of composition. The convention of the time of composition is to vary the piece or a passage when it is repeated. And maybe he's exaggerating this in order to, well, capture new audiences or to put the work more fresh. But if we analyze this performance, it's really historically informed, because it's performing a forte piano, an instrument, an historical instrument. He's following this convention of the time. He's strictly score compliant, and the only difference may be a cadenza at the end. But it is used to know that Mozart played his works in this way, maybe introducing some cadenza. So I think that although we may have these cases of normative conflict, like these of Karajan with Beethoven's 5, these of Mahler with Beethoven's 9, and other cases, I have several doubts that first, Steyer's case is an extreme case, and I think that he's score compliant in an historical sense, because he's putting to an extreme the historical conventions of the time of composition. So I have a different way of seeing this case.
Well, I mean, I think if this sort of musicological dispute here, right? I mean, if it turns out that Steyer's performance is score compliant, then it's not a good case for Julian to it's not a good illustration of Julian's view, right? Because it turns out it's not going to be a case of interpretive authenticity trumping score compliance. So we could have the musicological discussion, but I'm no musicologist, so I'll just I'll let the musicological chips fall where they may. As for the first kinds of examples, I mean, I think it's a little too quick, right, as a philosopher to say, Mahler messed around with Beethoven, so there's clearly normative space in the practice to do this. I mean, people doing all sorts of stuff in the practice, right? It's like, but when we come to do philosophy, we have to kind of think, what is going on here? Like, can all of these things really be performances of these works? It seems like we've got arrangements of works. We kind of know what they are. It's like so very similar, but not quite the same work. Mahler says what he's doing here isn't an arrangement, it's just a performance of Beethoven. But is that really the right way to think about it, right? So it's like, just because Mahler's doing this stuff and he and maybe other people are calling it a performance, that's not, I mean, that's just the beginning. That's just sort of data, right? It seems like we've got to then start doing the philosophical analysis.
Yes, but while doing this philosophical task, other thing is try to accommodate in the best way the practice. So for me, it's quite strange, and it is a consequence that a philosopher, it's a challenge for me to try to entail that from my view. For instance, a composer like Mahler or like Wagner, that they want to perform that work, or even Karajan or Horowitz at this time, they want to perform that work, that they are mistaken. So to entail an error theory for them that they do not understand really well the practice. If I don't understand the practice as a philosopher, the musical practice I find okay. But for me, it's quite strange that figures like that are central to musical practice. We are not speaking about aficionados. We are not speaking about that, but people that are at the core of the musical history and the Western musical tradition, to say that they are mistaken about the practice, about the performance practice, for me, it's quite strange, even when they use these words. And Mahler, for instance, well, he was accused of doing an arrangement of Beethoven's Nine. He was accused of that. But he's saying,
what was the maximum sentence for that crime?
But not this was not the case of Wagner. Nobody thought that Wagner was doing an arrangement or a different work. So it seems that, well, these different terminologies have a specific use and have a specific regulation in musical practice, and we don't need to be revisionary about that without compelling reasons about it. So we have that Wagner is trying to do that, and he thinks this way. So is there, my question as a philosopher, is there any way to accommodate and to explain this phenomenon without saying that Wagner, Mahler, and Bruckner and the like are mistaken about that? So this is my philosophical attitude towards this point as a philosopher. This is my point of view.
Yeah, it just seems to me that musicians, I mean, look at the authentic performance debate in the 20th century. Like, the musicians are all over the place, right? They're all saying contradictory things. There's, the old-fashioned people are describing the new kind of historically informed performers as being like hippies and, all this kind of stuff. It's like, they're just as confused about it as anyone else, right? And it's like, I take it, if the philosophers have anything to offer, it's a kind of critical distance and a certain set of conceptual tools that can maybe help us all understand what's going on a little more clearly. And I think everyone's open to the possibility of being wrong about how they're describing their actions.
Right. Thank you so much. Let's open the discussion. I think that there are other hands there.
Yeah, I think we can give the floor to Irida, who has a question for Andrew, I guess, or for Dodo.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm a bit of a wild card in this seminar. I guess I'm bringing in a slightly different perspective. I guess the comparison you had to literature or novelists or filmmakers and so on, I always wonder about the comparison to mathematics, because that never gets mentioned, or at least I haven't heard it mentioned in the philosophy of music as a significant way to think about the interpretation of something that is scored, even in mathematics. So what is an authentic proof? What is an authentic delivery of a proof? Is it the same proof when it becomes a different proof? Do I have the ability to change it? Is it then seen as me delivering the same proof, or is it now completely different, and so on? So I come from the perspective of my PhD project. So I already have a PhD in mathematics, but now I'm working on one in philosophy, and it's trying to look at precisely the question of scoring mathematical works versus scoring literature. So looking at novels and things like that. And I'm trying to say that, well, it's not that different. We have a lot of differences and everybody sees it as very different, and everyone can name a million reasons why it's different. But I'm trying to build up a hermeneutics which shows that the mechanisms of interpretation, and I actually stand on the side where the finished literary work has to be interpreted by the reader. So it can't be just, it's not the end of the process. There has to be an interpretation. I have to be enculturated in the way of interpreting that work. I can't just read a foreign language and so on. So that works for mathematics in the more extreme, because mathematics requires more training, or at least we think it requires more training. So I guess I've been joining here for the past 6 months and listening to you people talk about all of your work, precisely because I think in my work, what's missing is the perspective of music. Because it's, we always focus, well, you were focusing on the literature and music, and I'm focusing on literature and maths, but somehow music is, in my case, the third component, and I think in your case, mathematics is the third component, or at least I think it would be beneficial for us. I mean, it doesn't have to be me, you can do it with someone else, it doesn't matter, but for people to look at this comparison more seriously from today's point of view, when we do have the idea of, oh, we don't have to discuss the ontology of the object, we can actually discuss the practice and look how it's done, look how people interpret, and so on. But we can also look at historical stuff or discuss the ontology, but do the comparison or the contrasts or the differences for mathematics and music. So I don't know if you have any direct response to this as a kind of just suggestion idea, or if anyone here is willing to embark on this as a kind of informal chat. It doesn't have to be here, it can be at a different forum, to try to develop this a little further, to see whether there's anything really productive that could be said, because I don't think much is or has been said so far.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I probably don't have anything very helpful to say, but it sounds like, yeah, I'd like to, I mean, basically just will be asking you more questions. I mean, the places where I don't know how much you know the philosophy of music stuff, but basically it seems to me where mathematics comes up is that people draw analogies between Platonic views of the ontology of musical works, like Julian's view, Peter Kivey's view, and the ontology of mathematical proofs. Now, am I even going to get this right? I mean, I think you're right that it's fairly superficial, but the idea is something like the mathematical properties are all there, and the mathematicians just discover these. They write them down, and we say this person has discovered this.
So that's proof. That's the Platonic way. Then there's the other one where there's nothing there and we're just manipulating symbols and there's nothing. Like there's no ontological reality. That's the other side.
Okay, right.
So my hermeneutics is trying to take a middle way, which allows for both camps to agree with what I'm saying, to interpret it the way they like, but I don't do a commitment. So I'm not actually trying to answer this question definitively. It's a very practice-based approach.
Yeah, so yes, I'm not sure. For me, the disanalogies come to mind first. I mean, when you talk about the analogy with music, it's funny. It's like, it's just the sort of thing I was criticizing my critics for earlier, thinking, well, hold on, but in mathematics, you're not creating a work that then gets performatively interpreted. You are, of course, creating something that must be understood by, as you say, kind of enculturated readers or thinkers or whatever you want to call them.
But you are performing it every time you teach it, or every time you tell it to someone, or every time you do it in a paper of your own. You can't just always recall a thing. You actually have to perform the proof for yourself in the context that is relevant to you.
Yeah, that strikes me as a different sense of performance to work performance, though. in the sense of, I perform the same actions when I brush my teeth every night, but I'm not, that's not the same sense of kind of work performance.
But it is, because there is an identity of the proof, and all mathematicians, when somebody performs a proof, so to speak, if they deviate sufficiently much from it, they're going to say, no, that's not actually the proof that you were doing. You claim to be doing that, but you deviated. You had a creative embellishment that went one step too far, and it's no longer the proof that you claimed you were doing. Similar, I recognize some elements of the other proof. I see where you're coming from, but that's the fantasia element. So you've kind of gone off on your own thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure I have anything kind of helpful to say off the top of my head about that.
Okay, maybe someone else in the room.
Maybe someone else does. Yeah.
Or as I say, if anyone's interested, please, speak up so I can contact you. Or if you're not interested, that's fine too. I'll continue on my own. But yeah, I just want to. You are the experts on this, so
I'm interested.
Oh, okay.
I'm interested, but I haven't got a huge amount to say. Another source of disanalogy might be this, that the point of doing the proof, performing the proof, as you put it, is to get to a certain result, which is very clear and doesn't stand in need of interpretation, as it were. You've done it. You've proved that theorem, say. Musical performance looks much more open-ended than that, where if I'm right, the point of it is to evince understanding of a certain thing, and two performances can be, as it were, equally good from that perspective, but end up in very different places. It can sound very different. So my sense of the proof in maths is that there's a place you've got to end up. There's a destination point, which is very tightly circumscribed.
So that's the sort of popular view of mathematics, but the modern view of mathematics is that it's all about actually doing the proof.
Yeah, but
whether you end up at the place or you don't end up, you end up making a mistake or you don't finish it and so on, isn't so important. It's the actual process. You have to go through the process in order to elicit understanding of what is going on. Just giving you the end result is not good enough.
Of course it's not, but there is a destination. To succeed in doing the proof, right, you've got to end up in a certain spot that you have actually proved the theorem.
But that's
what you're aiming at.
You have to complete the score. If you don't complete the score, then...
Yeah, but there can be two, but there can be two, it looks to me as a novice when it comes to the philosophy of maths, right, that there can be very divergent destinations in a performance of a musical work that doesn't seem to be reflected in two successful proofs of a theorem. The destination is the same. You prove the theorem. That's it.
No, the destination is to exhibit the proof of the theorem, the same way that the destination in music is to exhibit the score in a performance. That's where I'm drawing the analogy.
Sorry, say that again.
So I'm saying in mathematics, the idea is to go through the whole proof. So the destination is the performance of the whole proof, not just the end line. I'm looking at destination differently. The same way that for you, you have to go through the performance of the whole score, whether what you elicit in the listeners is one thing, understanding of one kind or of another kind, can also be the case in mathematics. Whether I'm just trying to give you the mechanical thing, so you've seen and understood the mechanics of the proof, or whether I'm trying to get to some kind of deeper interpretative thing, which I, as the lecturer or as the presenter, imbue in the proof, in the exhibition of the proof itself.
Okay, this seems to me to be, and maybe I'm an old-fashioned Phrygian or something. This seems to me to be a striking view of proving. It seems to be that, very naively, I think the point of a proof is to prove something, and if you prove something, then you've succeeded.
And that's what I'm saying. This is the old view.
Now, here's the disanalogy that, of course, there's a sense in which the point to perform a work of music is to perform that work of music, but the destinations can sound very different. What's the sense in which you can have two successful, as it were, performances of a proof in which the theorem is proved, but the destinations are very different?
So it depends on the audience. The destination can be the mechanical exhibition of the way we manipulate certain symbols to come to the end line, so to speak.
All right.
The other one can be for a more adult audience where, yes, I'm doing the same proof, but I'm focusing in my interpretation more on the depth behind why this is done, for example. So what I write on the board in both cases will be identical, but the way I perform it for the audience in front of me will be very, very different and will elicit a completely different response.
Okay, I'll have one more go.
Okay.
I'm thinking of logic proofs, right? I'm asked to prove a theorem in logic. The destination is QED, I've proved it, right? That's it, I've succeeded.
What's the destination that I'm talking
That's what
about?
counts as success.
No,
And it seems to me that
no,
performing a work of music
no, that's the
isn't
whole
like that.
That's the whole point. That's what I'm saying. That's the old school. Nowadays, we have this whole practice, the philosophy of mathematical practice. And there, what counts as the destination is the whole proof, the whole exhibition of the entirety. It's not the end line. The bell can ring and I cannot come to the end line, for example, but I've still imparted the deeper meaning of the proof, and they can go and think about it on their own and so on. Okay. No, I'm just trying.
I suspect there's an equivocation. I suspect, it's the final thing I'm going to say it because I'm so ignorant of this, but I suspect there's an equivocation over the word destination.
Yes.
To mean end of the proof and a broader purpose.
I mean, what it sounds to me, if I can leap in on this one,
I would like to
I mean, what you're just...
Got two people talking.
Oh.
Yeah, but I would like to say at this point, it's that, right, so the exhibition of the whole proof,
Can you
the
hear?
process
Can
is
you
what
hear?
is-
Sorry, no, can you hear him? Because otherwise we have to.
With
Can you hear me?
echoes, but yes.
No?
It's very good.
Okay. And now?
So, right, so can you hear me now?
Yes.
There's a relevant point here in order to draw the analysis or differences, and in relation to what Julian says, is the kind of justifications that you may have when you have a mistake or not. So when you're doing the deduction, even if you are, the important is the performance of the whole deduction and not the end point of the deduction. The point is, if you are right, mistaken, or in the deduction, you take another path instead of deducting directly. But if you find a mistake, or if you decide to take this decision or the other, which kind of reasons or justifications you adduce here? Because in the case of a performance, you can give artistic reasons, and artistic reasons has a subjective ground. And this subjective ground is sometimes related to aesthetic judgments and the like. So here is the same kind of justifications that you have or you find when you are going in this direction of the deduction or not. Or is just the explanation is this deduction is right, this is a right way, or they enter other criteria like simplicity, elegance, that are aesthetic values, but they are measured in a different way than other kinds of aesthetic reasons. So for me, it's the important point here to ascertain.
So in
I have no response to it.
Okay. So I was going to say, in mathematics, you also talk about the aesthetics, obviously, of a certain choice, and you justify making a deviation or not because I prefer to do it this way. I think this way is simpler, nicer, more elegant, and so on. So there is a very strong aesthetic and subjective component in justifying deviations from a certain proof. So in that sense, it's very similar. I mean, that's why I'm bringing this up, not because I kind of want to make this analogy. It's more because I think it is a relevant analogy to explore with professionals who have thought about this and who are willing to hear the mathematics side of it without dismissing it as just being old school or yeah, as looking at mathematics as just being this mechanical delivery of a certain point.
Right, I think this point right, but the aesthetic virtues appealed in mathematics, for me, they are very simple aesthetic virtues. So you can define easily the elegance of a proof.
No, you can't.
Can find, you can define the simplicity in terms of simplicity, or the beauty of No, that's an interesting point. Say about that, because I think that this is the key point.
There is a huge debate in the philosophy of mathematical practice nowadays on what we actually mean by simple or elegant and so on. What are the criteria? Because if it is so simple to say what simple is or what elegant is, there should be criteria, or there should be context in which we all agree, that you poll the room and everybody says, yes, I agree, this is the case. And studies have shown that this is not the case, that this varies. So they have even done statistical analyses of papers, they have done interviews and so on. So there is no consensus on this. There is a school of thought that we are all taught to consider this one proof as simple. But in general, if you give me a generic proof, to judge whether it's simple or not will depend on my background, how quick I am in this subject, my personal preferences, because I as a mathematician have personal preferences for types of proof, just because I'm a visual person. So for me, a type of visual proof is very, very elegant. You give me numbers, I have no idea what to do with them. That's, rubbish for me. So there is a very, very strong debate about this, and there is no consensus. This view, that's why I'm again interacting here. I think this view isn't up to date with what's happening nowadays and kind of the currents and the way mathematics is being seen, even as a creative endeavor comparable to literature, which is the whole point of my project.
Right, thank you so much. But the interest to my view is in that point, in the kind of justifications you can give. But thank you very much, and it is a different topic about the relations between music and mathematics. Thank you.
Thank you.
One final go.
Well, Andrew wanted to go. Yes.
Which is this. So yeah, I'm familiar with some of the literature on aesthetic properties in maths and science. To me, there seems to be a difference in how embedded they are in the practice compared to in musical performance, because it seems to me that written into the very purpose of musical performance are these aesthetic, maybe artistic values, that it doesn't seem that in the same way to me that they're written into the purpose of maths and science. They're a kind of a spandrel, kind of a side, a side issue. It's really nice if a mathematical proof is whatever you want to call it, simple or elegant, but ultimately, if it's not, it'll do the job. There isn't really this sense, the same, that kind of sense with music.
So I completely agree, and that is a
Okay.
cultural inscription, as you say, of an artistic work having the subjective component, whereas something which is considered to be science is considered to be, as I say, cold, objective, and mechanical, and the aesthetical values are only a side issue, which have nothing.
I'm not saying mechanical. I'm not saying cold. I'm talking about aesthetic values.
Okay, fine.
Very creative.
Are considered on the side, are considered, as you say, a secondary consideration where each of us carries on our own, but it's not something that's inscribed in the practice itself. And that's where I'm saying the opinions are shifting now to consider more the importance, also historically in different cultures that mathematics, but also nowadays, whether mathematics really is what it is, like this science, or whether the aesthetic values do determine how and what we prove.
I'm not denying the importance, I'm denying the embeddedness in the telos.
I'm just saying this is what we're exploring now. This is how it's shifting. I'm not denying you're correct. That's correct.
Okay, one last word from Andrew, if you want to add something, and then we.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I doubt this is of much interest. I'm sure you've thought about this before, but I mean, I think it's coming out of a place that's quite similar to what Julian was saying. But I was wondering, when you were talking about giving the same proof twice, given exactly the same way, but in one context you're trying to do one thing with it, and the other you're trying to do another thing with it. Again, this is going to probably strike you as deflationary or missing the point or something, but it's started to resonate with me with my very minimal knowledge of philosophy of language stuff, right? Where it's like, I almost wanted to think, well, hold on, isn't this the case where like the proof has a certain kind of content, just like a sentence might have a certain kind of content, but you could use pragmatically that proof in one situation to emphasize mechanics, and another situation to emphasize sort of deep context, and maybe another you should do all sorts of things, right? I mean, presumably you could execute a proof as a kind of, fuck you to your colleagues, right? Who think you're not capable of doing this proof. So you kind of do it just to kind of piss them off. But somehow, again, I would want to say, like Julian, these are uses of proofs. I mean, we could use musical works in the same way, but they're not uses that are somehow central or central to what makes mathematics mathematics. Now, of course, there is the practice of mathematics, as you're saying, but I'm wondering if there's a bunch of different things that could name too, right? Because for instance, analytic philosophers have this reputation, deservedly, of being well, should I say the practice has this reputation of being kind of masculine and bullying, and I think that's true as a kind of sociological description. It's unfortunate and it should be changed, but it's just a contingent feature, I hope, of the practice. It's not, as Julian would say, it's nothing to do with the telos of analytic philosophy. So my ignorant intuition would be that something like that is going on in the mathematics case too. Is that there's the practice of mathematics that you could describe in a sociological sense, but then there's also, like, mathematics, there's something to mathematics that's independent of any particular social manifestation of it or something like that.
Okay, so that's making kind of an ontological statement.
I'm sorry, Irina, I think we have to leave the room for the moment because it's like at lunchtime. We have to, but I hope you'll be able to join us in the afternoon and we can continue the discussion. Sorry for interrupting, but it's like.
Thank you very much for the feedback and for the chance to discuss this with you.
And do contact me.
Oh, okay. Okay, I wasn't sure. You were so negative. I wasn't sure you actually wanted that.
Negative in a good way.
Okay.
It's kind of, I'm just discussing it with you. So here we have two people with different intuitions, and we might get something really good at the end of it.
Thank you very much. Yes.
All right.
I mean, 2 hours then. Yeah.
I'll say that too.
Yes.
Again, I feel like I will get a lot more out of it than you will, I suspect, since I don't know anything about mathematics.
We could be a bit negative, but we're basically quite harmless.
Yes.
Okay. I'm harmless too, despite my practice of mathematics. I'm also quite harmless. It's not scary, as you see. It's
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for
And I will.
Will you be able? I don't know what time it will be, and maybe too late for you.
It'll be like 3 a.m. when Messi take the stage. So I'm afraid I'm not going to stay up for it, but I assume it will be recorded so that I can hear it at another time.
I'm questioning your commitment, Kania.
Don't worry, I won't be doing anything else. I won't be doing anything more fun.
You bloody lightweight.
Okay, so have
Cheers,
a good
Andrew. Nice to see you, mate.
Yeah,
Take care.
Good to see you
3 p.m.
all.
we will
Take
start
care.
again. Okay. Bye, everybody. Ciao.
Bye.